David's father have. And after we got through the invitation, I addressed it a little bit, and the live stream started. So the point being is that I want to sort of address that question again because there are people on the live stream that maybe didn't get to see that. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we're introduced to David. And let's just give a little bit of a brief recap to begin. Again, 1 Samuel 16, we're introduced to David. 1 Samuel 15, it ended with God essentially telling Saul, through Samuel, God has rejected you. This is essentially final. Now God's going to go find his man. And as we know, a man after his own heart, as evidence, as it ties in with 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. So we see, and we're introduced to David. We know, of course, that this whole process of, how David selected because he was sort of looking for maybe the oldest, the most physically imposing person that would serve very well as a king. And we know based on 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, God just simply tells Samuel, you're not looking for the right thing. You need to think about how I am viewing this. I'm looking on the inside rather than on the outward appearance. And we talked about, again, this process. The sons of Jesse come before him until it gets to David. But we note in verse 10 that Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And we know that at this point, David has not yet passed before Samuel based on verse 11. And as we talked about, what appears in this text is that Jesse has 8 sons. And everything seems fine. But again, what we want to point out is what is recorded for us in 1 Chronicles chapter 2. In 1 Chronicles chapter 2, we're given a list of really the house of Judah, the descendants of Judah. And we know that David is called the 7th son of Jesse. And so we noted that this is potentially a problem, right? Because it's noted back in 1 Samuel 16, verse 10, that Jesse had 7 sons that passed before David did. So David would technically be the 8th. But 1 Chronicles 2, verse 15 suggests that David's actually the 7th son. So did Jesse have 8 or 7 sons? We talked about how that's a potential contradiction. But one of the responses to that question is actually that what Samuel is doing in 1 Samuel 16 is that he's using a literary device, similar to what is recorded for us in Revelation chapter 17. And so I want to, just for a moment, turn over to Revelation chapter 17. Because John here does something similar to what Samuel is doing. And we're not going to talk about what all is going on in Revelation chapter 17 in terms of what the beast are being talked about here, what that means. But I do want to note Revelation 17, verse 11. The beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7th, and goeth into perdition. Now you note there, how in the world can he be the 8th, but yet be of the 7th, right? If there's only 7, you can't have 8, right? But what we talked about, what's going on here, is that when what Revelation says, this last beast that's being talked about, when it's called the 8th of the 7th, all that's doing is putting more emphasis on the final beast. And all it suggests was that it was worse than the 6 that came before it. I likened it to the fact that I don't like carrot cake, right? If you ask me on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do I like carrot cake? And I told you that I disliked carrot cake and I gave you the number 11. On a 10-point scale, that doesn't make sense, right? Because 10 is the highest number that you can go to. But if I say that I dislike something 11 out of 10, what am I trying to do?
You really hate it.
Yeah, I really hate it, right? But beyond even that scale. And so it's just a way of putting extra emphasis. 1 Samuel 16, David is the 7th son, but the way that Samuel puts David as the 8th, all he's doing is putting extra emphasis on David compared to the other sons of Jesse, right? And that's why we know it's important, because it's not Abinadab, it's not Shema, it's not Eliab or any of the other sons of Jesse. It's David that's going to be king. And what Samuel's doing is just putting extra emphasis on David. And so it's not a contradiction. It's just Samuel's trying to put more emphasis on David, as we see moving forward. So that point is important for us to note. For those that may not have been able to watch, not this past Wednesday, but 2 Wednesdays ago, that's sort of the explanation to that question. I think it's, based on my research, I think it's a pretty good explanation for it. All right, so what we want to do this morning is essentially just get through the rest of the chapter. So we'll begin in verse 14. We'll get down through verse 23. This is a passage that should be somewhat familiar to us, but this is essentially when David first encounters Saul. He comes into Saul's service. Beginning in verse 14, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now we know that at the end of verse 13, we see that the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. And that coincides with verse 14. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon David. The Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul. Really, this is marking the boundaries of this section. Verses 14 through 23, the talking about the Spirit of the Lord departing from Saul is going to be emphasized again, verse 23. So that's the end of the section, but we keep in mind what had happened before. 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 6, in that particular passage, Saul has been told that he's going to become king. One of the signs of that is that he would be able to prophesy to other prophets. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 6, it says that the Spirit of the Lord will come upon thee, Samuel talking to Saul, and thou shalt prophesy with him and shalt be turned into another man, which is indeed what happened. 1 Samuel 11, verse 6, Saul hears about what the Ammonites have done. Verse 6, and the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard those tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly. And so we've pointed this out before, but when it talks about the Spirit of the Lord coming and departing, in this particular context, it's just talking about divine favor. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, 1 Samuel chapter 11, Saul is God's anointed. God has not rejected Saul at this point, and so the Spirit of the Lord being upon him, part of it suggests that God's divine favor was upon him. But when we come to 1 Samuel 16, we know that God has rejected Saul. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon David. His favor is pointed towards David, but now that means, verse 14, not that God has given up spiritually on Saul, but in terms of the kingdom per se, right? We know that God has taken the kingdom away from him, which is going to come to fruition. Something that might help us understand this, and I don't know if you have this in your cross-reference, but Psalm chapter 51, verse 11, is a situation that is somewhat comparable to this. Psalm 51 is often connected to, it's a song of lament. It's connected to David, who, more than what's given for us is that David wrote this psalm after Nathan confronted him about what he had done with Bathsheba, right? And David acknowledges his sin, and this is actually one of the songs that we sing at camp. I know at Freed Hardeman. I'm sure people gone to Freed Hardeman know this too. But verse 10, you know what David says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. And what David's talking about there is, maybe he's reflecting on what had happened to Saul earlier, right? Saul had fallen out of favor with God. God's favor left Saul. And potentially what David's talking about in Psalm 51, verse 11, is that he does not want to lose God's favor the same way that Saul did. Because this is after David had committed a great sin. So that's that's David's situation. Then that's Saul's situation in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14. An evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now we know that this is not God himself, right? An evil spirit from the Lord. It's not the Spirit of the Lord doing this. And that's important to note. We know James chapter 1, verse 13. God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man, right? He doesn't tempt man with sin. But we do know, of course, that, God, although he doesn't tempt man with sin, he does allow man to be tempted, right? We know that based on James chapter 1 as well. Deuteronomy chapter 13, gives indication to that as well, that while God does not tempt man with sin, he does allow for it to essentially test man's faithfulness to him. Perhaps this is what's going on. Perhaps you do have an evil spirit that is afflicting Saul. We know that God, obviously through the miracles of Jesus, we know that God has power over good and evil spirits, right? We understand that. I will point out that there are some people that have suggested that potentially Saul suffered from bipolar disorder. And Abby, who is the rest say. Yeah, it's when you have two different personalities, you're prone to dramatic mood swings. If you pay attention to Saul, and if you read very carefully, it could have been that Saul suffered from this. Maybe what's going on here is that, the evil spirit is afflicting Saul maybe in that way by playing off of this. Some have suggested that. We don't have any direct evidence, but it is an interesting idea when you look at how Saul, on a lot of occasions, can dramatically change his mind, almost like he's two different people. So Saul's in a pretty difficult situation. Verses 15 and 16, his servants recognize that. They say unto him, Behold, now an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee to seek out a man who is a cunning player on a harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. Right, so Saul's servants acknowledge what's going on. The word here for servant, you're not thinking of sort of a slave in the sense here. You're thinking more of his officials, or the nobles that surround Saul's court, who have obviously observed what's going on. Perhaps they've observed Saul making some bad decisions, and maybe that's what they chalk up what's going on here. Saul's being troubled by what's being described in verse 14. They need to figure out a way to get over it. And so they come up with a decision, well, let's get a man that will play music for you. The harp, the harp, that's the harp or the lyre, that's the instrument that is suggested here. Now, in other cultures at the time, we're told that the harp was an instrument that was often associated with divine power. And a lot of times a harp was used in other cultures to sort of get rid of bad spirits. Now, we don't know if that's true with the Israelites, but in other cultures at the time, we're told that was the case. Nevertheless, the harp is a very common instrument at the time. And you just think about this in a practical sense, right? Music can sometimes be a great way of calming people. Just personal example, whenever I work, one thing that I love to do is I like to listen to either movie soundtracks or classical music, because for me it helps me concentrate. It helps, depending on the style of classical music, if it's pretty fast, it's motivating in a sense. It gets my brain stimulated. This time of year, what do people like to listen to get in a good mood? Christmas music, right? A lot of people turn on the radio. I know, was it 93.3 plays Christmas music right now. And for a lot of people, that's if they're in a bad mood, they listen to Christmas music. That gets them in a good mood. We can kind of understand that. We also understand, though, that the fact that bad music can be unsettling, right? We're going to notice that in a minute, but the emphasis is going to be the fact that he can play well. I know when I was growing up, when I first started band in middle school, one of the first things that I think they told all the parents of the students there is that whenever your kid first plays their instrument, it's not going to sound great at all. In fact, I think one of the band directors said it's probably going to sound like a dog getting hit by a car, as bluntly and lovingly as he could put it. But the point is that if you're not very well experienced, you can't pick up an instrument and play it perfectly. It takes time to develop those skills. I'm not prone to watching horror movies. I know Dad and Abby really are. And I'm usually in my. If they watch a horror movie, I'm in my bedroom. I'm not close to the living room. I'm not a big fan of those movies. But I can tell they're watching a horror movie sometimes because of the music, and that's a lot of times we don't think about not just horror movies, but anything that's suspense, screen, track, music. You know, sometimes you get that eerie sound, that creepy sound, right? There's a reason why it's that way, because it's designed to be that way. And that's part of what makes things suspenseful in movies and things like that, because of the type of music that they use. Well, that's not going to be the type, you think about in this particular case, the type of music you play is very important, because you're trying to get Saul in a good mood. And I think we could point out something that is very true. Maybe a point of application that ties in with this. And that's simply the fact that we might ask the question, did David's playing of the harp solve all of Saul's problems with God? No, right? Saul's problem obviously extended back because he refused to be obedient to God. And I think this is something similar to what some people experience today. Not that whenever we get upset, we fall into sin, that we go and find somebody to play a harp for us and put us in a good mood. But sometimes when we're at odds with God, we have a tendency to try to find something else to get our mind off of what we've done, right? Maybe that's something like, something like putting all of our interest into, sports or fishing or some type of recreational activity where, maybe we've done something, maybe we're living in sin, but we try to put our attention towards those things to take our mind off of what we've done wrong. And so we try to use something else to get our mind off, to try to solve our issues with God. And Saul very well, it obviously works for a time period, just like those things that we put our attention to, sports, fishing, any recreational activities. To some degree, it works for a time, but it doesn't last. We know that it doesn't last. We know that with the case of Saul, it doesn't last, right? Because what's going to be illustrated here is that this has to happen over and over again to help settle him. But Saul's bigger issues, obviously, they weren't going to be solved by David playing the harp. It might have provided some temporary relief, but Saul had bigger issues. He needed to go about it a lot different way if he wanted to completely get rid of some of these issues that he was having with God, and obviously that involves repentance. But that's something that I think we can pull out from this text. I want to move on down to verses 17 and 18. Saul certainly recognizes this, right? Saul said unto his servant, "Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me." And then answered one of the servants and said, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite that is cunning and playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and a prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him." Right, so it makes sense to Saul. If music can help temporarily get some of this anxiety away, we might could say, then certainly that's the good option. But you note here, we're not told that this is David yet, but we know that based on the description that this is talking about David, a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. I want you to note a couple of these characteristics here. He is a cunning man in playing. The root there of that Hebrew word means to know from experience. And just as I mentioned before, if you want to be able to play an instrument well, you don't pick it up and start playing it well right off the bat. You got to practice. There's no other way around it. And that's important for us to note, the idea of being able to play based on experience, because in chapter 17, when we think about the story of David and Goliath, a lot of times David's portrayed as like an 8 to 10-year-old, a fairly young child, when in reality he wasn't. He was a good bit older than that. But I've seen in a lot of children's books, when this is depicted, that David's sort of a small child when he goes to fight Goliath. That's more than likely that is not the case based on how David is described here. He has experience in playing. It takes, to be able to play well, that takes a good deal of time to learn an instrument to be able to play it well. David's not a very young child at this point. David, of course, had great musical talents. We know that from the book of Psalms. 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 1 goes further to talk about that. And actually, some of David's Psalms are recorded in some of the other books of the Bible outside of the book of Psalms. So certainly this fits the characteristic of David. I'll read to you 2 Samuel 23, verse 1. Just the fact that the very last thing that David did in his life was, what was recorded about his life is this psalm that he sang, which closes out the book of 2 Samuel. So he's obviously someone with great musical talent. And we know that he is called, again, he's a mighty, valiant man, a man. And this is important because of what was said back in 1 Samuel 14, verse 52. Because what 1 Samuel 14:52 tells us is essentially Saul's policy during his reign. And his policy, according to that verse, was that when they were fighting the Philistines, which happened, as the text says, all the days that Saul lived, when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him. And so, verse 18, what's said about David by his servants is that he's a mighty, valiant man. He's a man of war. And so, naturally, Saul's going to take this man in. If they don't believe that he can be useful in terms of providing music, they know Saul's going to agree with this because of his description as being a man of war, because that had been Saul's entire policy as long as they fought the Philistines. And so that's an important verse, I think, to tie in with it, that David's description fit exactly what Saul wanted in terms of the men that served him. So verses 19 and 20, Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, Send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a bottle of wine and a kid, and sent them by David his son unto Saul. One thing that I didn't note, I meant to note this in verse 18. It said about David that he is prudent in matters. The idea here is that he was discerning in his speech. He was a man that was fairly well educated. He was a good speaker. Was the idea that's presented here behind David's description. And then most importantly, I didn't mention this, but verse 18, right? The most important description here is that the Lord is with him. And this is something that is said a lot about David. It's the first time this is said about him. But going forward in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, this is going to be said a lot about David, which, again, contrasts him with Saul. You don't really see Saul being mentioned in that same light. But David is going to be portrayed as such. We'll talk about maybe next week or a couple weeks when David goes to take on Goliath. He just points out to Saul, when he's talking to Saul, that God would be with him. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 12. Saul was afraid of David, and this is later on, because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. So that phrase becomes characteristic of David. And maybe that's an important, that is an important point of application to draw. You know, we have all the things that people can say about us, right? We have a tendency as people to like to hear compliments about ourselves. I don't think we like to hear criticism about ourselves. We like to hear all the things that people like about us, but what's most important within all of those compliments? Well, with the story of David, you're going to see over and over again that the best compliment that's provided about his character is that God was with him. And likewise, I think that point of application should be true with us. It doesn't matter what type of praise people put on us. If people can look at us and say, you know, that's the type of person that God would be with, well, that's probably the best compliment we could ever receive, right? David certainly is a good example of that, and I think that's a point of application. The most important compliment we can get would be that phrase, the Lord is with him. So all those characteristics lead to Saul to agree. They send forth for David. You note again, verse 20, that when David's called, his father sends with him a donkey laden with bread, a bottle of wine, a kid, and sent them by David his son unto Saul. Just a reference there to again, generally, whenever a person, it was often customary to present king. When people from around the world came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, they often brought gifts to give Solomon because he was a king. So verses 21 through 23, we're going to wrap up here in a couple minutes. So let's read through these 3 verses. David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. Right, so David's obviously not just proven himself useful in terms of playing a harp, but he's become his armor bearer, a very important, sort of almost in a way, the right-hand servant to the king in that sense. So Saul certainly wants David to stay around. And then verse 23, it came to pass when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul that David took a harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. Verse 23, what that indicates to us is that this happened on multiple occasions. It's just sort of a summary of what happened. Anytime Saul was afflicted in spirit, David played a harp, Saul was refreshed. This happened over and over again. So we know that David at this point, he's been anointed. But like Saul back in 1 Samuel chapter 11, Saul had to prove himself in a way to show to the people that he would be the king. And as we pointed out, a lot of times that was done through military action. Right? In the case of 1 Samuel 11, Saul delivers the Israelites from, or the men of Jabesh Gilead from the Ammonites. 1 Samuel 17, David proves himself militarily by taking on Goliath and defeating Goliath. And that's a story that we'll save for later. Well, that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we talked about this morning?
You know, if God is not in my heart, the devil is. One or the other is going to be in my heart. And I'm sort of reminded of the parable Jesus gave about the empty house, the fellow that had a spirit, and the spirit left, and you know, he came back and found it empty. In other words, the guy didn't replace the bad with good things, and so since he didn't do that, all the evil spirits came in. And so, you know, if I want the Lord in my heart, there's something I need to work on, because if he's not there, the devil is.
Right. And I think that really sums up the story of Saul and David. Both of those men had problems with sin. The difference was Saul didn't have the willingness to repent like he should have and left the door open. David, when he repented, part of what repentance is making sure that there's no room left for the devil to enter in, right? And that really sums up the stories of Saul and David very well. With that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up with 1 Samuel chapter 17 on Wednesday night.